In her paper, Age, Race, Class and Sex, Women Redefining Difference, social activist, poet and feminist Audre Lorde writes, "We find ourselves having to repeat and relearn the same old lessons over and over that our mothers did, because we do not pass on what we have learned or because we're unable to learn." She goes on to add that ignoring the differences of race between women and the implications of those differences presents the most serious threat to the mobilization of women's joint power. While here, we strive to honor the knowledge of our foremothers. Here, we do the work of building our differences into intimacies. Here, we heal in the pursuit of freedom. Welcome to the second episode of I Stand as 10,000, Healing with the New Daughters of Africa. My name is Buledi, and I'll be your guide on this journey.
Always come from freedom.
Oh, mama, tell them what God has made. Oh, mama. Only if milk rest melody, then they see signatory. Maybe light up that. Happy Freedom Day, beautiful people. Today I stand as Sarah Parker Remond. Sarah Parker was a lecturer, an activist, and a slave trade abolitionist. She was a leading voice in the American anti-slavery movement, which makes her work and life story so aligned for today's episode as we reflect on Freedom Day and think about what freedom really means for us. But before I jump in, if at the end of the episode you like what I'm serving, click the subscribe button down below. My posting schedule is a little bit irregular, so if you don't want to miss the next episode, click on the notification bell. After each episode, I like to have a bit of an interactive session on my Instagram, so follow me at BagLadyGreens. Should be on your screen or in the description box down below. I'm always keen to exchange ideas, so I'd love to hear from you about the show, the platform, the topic of the particular episode you watched. But if you're watching this on YouTube, like, comment, like I said, I'd love to hear from you and really build a community of love and healing. One of my favorite things about researching Sarah Parker Remond was that in every description of her, the first words that appear after her name are freeborn or born free. Now I know in South Africa when you hear the words born free, people start to roll their eyes. But for Sarah Parker Remond, this title is an achievement of substantial proportion. She was born into a family of abolitionists, which is just to say that people who were fighting against the slave trade in America. Her mother was one of the founders of the first black female anti-slavery society, and her brother, who some might know a little better, Charles Lennox Remond, also spoke alongside her in the fight against slavery. Now, I'll read you how Margaret Busby introduces her in the book. Sarah Parker Remond, 1815 to 1894. Born in Salem, Massachusetts, she grew up in an educated and abolitionist household. She became, along with her brother Charles Lennox Remond, a respected speaker for the American anti-slavery movement and gained wide acclaim as one of the few black women anti-slavery orators during lecture tours of Ireland and England between 1859 and 1861. While in Britain, she studied the classics at Bedford College for Women. She stayed at the home of the Honorary Secretary of the Ladies of London Emancipation Society and was among the 1,500 signatories to a petition requesting the right of women to vote, prepared in 1866. In her 40s, she moved to Florence, retrained as a doctor, and in 1877 married Sardinian painter Lazzaro Pintor Cabras. She never returned to the United States and remained in Italy until her death. Being raised in a family that spoke up against the violent treatment of Black people, Sarah found the power in her voice very early on. She gave her first speech at the age of 16 at an anti-slavery convention or gathering, and gradually gained prominence and fame as an anti-slavery speaker or orator, some might say. The research around her highlights an anti-slavery lecture tour that gave rise to her prominence. In the tour, as a representative of the anti-slavery society, she spoke alongside Susan B. Anthony, who was also a well-known Black female American activist. Those titles. And they, spoke around, traveling around America. But eventually, her voice and her lectures gained so much traction that it manifested an invitation to speak in the UK and to spread her anti-slavery message there. There she gave a speech titled "Why Slavery is Rampant." And that speech seems to have solidified her face as the first Black female anti-slavery speaker. I don't think she was necessarily the first in that way, but she was the first to gain so much prominence of that international scale, let's say. Margaret puts two entries in of Sarah Parker Remond. One is a speech, the speech, and another one is a letter. I'm going to read a little bit of what the speech says. I'll read a little bit of the intro. Although the anti-slavery enterprise was begun some 30 years ago, the evil is still rampant in the land, as there are some young people present, and I am glad to see them here, for it is important that they should understand the subject. I shall briefly explain that there are 32 states, 16 of which are free, and 16 slave states. The free states are in the north. The political feelings in the North and South are essentially different. So is the social life. In the North, democracy, not what the Americans call democracy, but the true principle of equal rights, prevails. I speak of the white population mind. Wealth is abundant. The country, in every material sense, flourishes. In the South, aristocratic feelings prevail. Labor is dishonorable, and 5 millions of poor whites live in the most degrading ignorance and destitution. I might dwell long on the miserable condition of these poor whites, the indirect victims of slavery, but I must go on to speak of the 4 millions of slaves. So the rest of the speech goes on to give more detail about the kind of horrendous acts and treatments that are going on towards Black people, how specifically, and she makes, in the introduction, makes a point to align the mindset of the wealth of the white people, and the kind of degradation or degree of violence that the Black people in that country or in that space endure. So, for example, as she says, in the North, where there's more wealth, where there's more abundance, there is more freedom given to Black people to be more free within themselves. I don't know if anyone's watched Self-Made. It is a series that started on Netflix, but I'm sure you can find it on the internet now. Self-Made kind of gives you a good visual of what that looks like. In the North, the black people, they are allowed to be more expressive, they're allowed to move more freely. It's still made clear in the social relating that there's a superiority of white people and black people are seen as inferior, but they have a little bit more free movement, a little less degradation, a lot more ideas of sophistication are sewed into the fabric of that kind of society, whereas in the South there's a lot more poverty across the board. But she makes a distinction to say that where the white people are less abundant in that area, so in the South there's more violence, more aggravation, more humiliation of slaves, of black people within the South. One thing that I find interesting, because remember, she's giving a speech to a community where slavery wasn't a concept they had. So in the UK, that's not to say that there wasn't racism, but there wasn't a slave trade in the UK. So she's giving them a picture of what's going on there. And it was 11:11 on the recording thing. Trying to paint a picture for them of what the American slave trade is like and just how terrible it is. And yes, she acknowledges that even for white people, in some sense, it's particularly white people in the South, there are those who are poor and who do feel poverty, but I'm here to speak to you specifically about the numerous other black people who are treated with such immorality. Excuse me. Here's my favorite part about the speech. It's 2 lines really that really for me took away something very important. I mean, I imagine that a lot of us have heard something about the American slave trade here or other, especially here in South Africa. I think for us, when we hear the American slave trade, some of the experiences we call up are the collective conscious experience of apartheid and what that meant for us, and the kind of degradation that our people feel when we have a recollection to a much more forcefully violent existence. That's not to say, I mean, you know, obviously there's a lot more or a different type, texture of violence now. But I want to bring it back quickly to the speech before I bring it home. In the speech, there are 2 lines that for me kind of really solidify the point that she's trying to make in her speech. And what action she wants her UK audience. Her UK audience is majority white and did not have a slave trade. So she's giving them a picture of what it looks like in the American slave trade for both white and black people, but focusing on the pain that black people are enduring at the hands of white people. And she's the only black face in a room, a lecture hall of white people. Not that visual, so the only black face in a lecture hall of white people speaking on the vile acts that are happening to black people, and really comes to the soul of this platform. So when I first heard the quote, "I stand as 10,000," it's a quote by Maya Angelou, but I heard it from Oprah in an interview that someone was giving Oprah, and they asked her, you know, first starting off, you were likely also the only black face in a boardroom or a room full of middle class or old white men. How did you do that without, you know, crumbling under nerves? And she said she called on a quote, by Maya Angelou that said, "I come as one, but I stand as 10,000." Here's why I think this is beautiful. Because of that visual of Sarah Parker Remond in a lecture hall of just white faces, and she's the only black face there, right? You would feel that she would be panicked with nerves. Yeah, she's good at speaking and things like that, but still you're in a foreign land and you're speaking to people and you're revealing really violent and what I would say in some ways intimate details of a nation. Nonetheless, the image of Sarah Parker Remond in the lecture hall giving this speech just for me had that resounding or resonance for that would be a kind of moment where you come as one, but you are representing the views, the hopes, the values, the dreams, the ambitions of 10,000. Profound for me, and really knocked on the message that I think Sarah Parker Remond was trying to get across was, I do not ask your political interference in any way. This is a moral question. That's it. She comes back later to say, as a proposition for them to take to action reads, now I ask for your sympathy and your influence. And whoever asked English men and women in vain, give us the power of your public opinion. It has great weight in America. Words spoken here are read there as no words written in America are read. Us the power of your public opinion. I think that's such an interesting line to say, I do not ask for your political interference in any way, as her clarifying what her intention is in the speech. I'll put the details of a link where you can listen to the speech in the description box below. But yeah, so she goes on in the speech to say, like I said, describing the nature and extent of violence in the slave trade and within the American fabric, really. But to clarify her intention, she says, I'm not looking, this is again to a UK audience, I'm not looking for your political interference. I don't want you to interfere politically in any way. I want you, and her call to action, and this is what I find very interesting, is that her call to action against slavery and within its own right, or within slavery, racism, right, against Black people, her call to action is sympathy for Black people, right? Because she says, now I ask for your sympathy and your influence. Sympathy, I would imagine in this case for Black people, and influence on what? On, and she says it in the first line, that I do not ask for your political interference in any way. This is a moral question, right? And then comes back to say, now I ask for your sympathy and your influence. So she is saying that a call to action against slavery, against racism, violent racism, is to have sympathy for Black people, or empathy. I mean, we can go on and on about what the right term could be in that regard, but also moral influence on the white people in America, on the slave masters, the slave traders. A call to raise the moral integrity of oppressors. This is for me very interesting, because often when I have discussions like this with my friends, people around me, just recently I had a discussion with it about my friends, about, in China, for example, right now a lot of Black people are getting thrown out of their apartments because they're Black, and there's this whole corona hysteria going on that's also seeming to manifest a lot of racism, but still, he was expressing a lot of anger about it, and often I find, and he had expressed a similar sentiment, but often I find when I talk to people about that, the discussion always comes down to Black people need to revolt more, need to fight back harder, need to become more violent than the oppressor as a way to show self-dominance as a way to show that self-love, I guess, as well, as a way of fighting for oneself. But I think here the call to raise the moral integrity of the oppressor, for me, says that what is the real root work of gaining a sense of freedom is not to out violence or become more violent than the oppressor, but rather to raise their moral integrity. Now, of course, I think the one successful thing in the point that Sarah Parker makes here is that she's speaking to the peers of the oppressors, right? She's speaking to an audience of white people, saying, raise the moral integrity of your national peers, to not treat Black people this way. Now, I make this point because, when I was preparing for this episode, I read the paper by Audre Lorde that I opened the episode with, and it really helped me kind of bring the whole situation home, right? Points about how I'm bringing this home. So Sarah Parker writes, the slaves are essentially things with no rights, political, social, domestic, or religious, the absolute victims of all but irresponsible power. For comparison about how the northern colored people or Black people were perceived, is that the free colored people of the northern states are for no crime but merely the fact of complexion, deprived of all political and social rights. Now, while we can never really claim to understand the collective wounds of having been a part of a nation that experienced slavery, we can call to our own experiences of apartheid, or our own collective wounds of apartheid. Even though you weren't in it, there's still something about being connected to a people who were in and part of that experience, especially if you're still experiencing the remnants of it. A more perhaps universal experience that we can all call on as Black people, whether having come from a lineage of slavery or apartheid, is the capitalist experience, right? The way in which capitalism deprives people of their social and political rights, the lower the socioeconomic status is. Let me say that again. The lower that a person's socioeconomic status is, so their access to money and social privilege, the more people in those communities are deprived of their social and political rights. Just because capitalism equates value with money and not the well-being of people. Specifically so, because socioeconomic lines are usually aligned with racial lines, we can say that then usually it is Black people, and specifically Black people who experience poverty, marginalization, any kind of depravity of social well-living, and having a political will that is heard and recognized and acknowledged. They're deprived of that because they have less access to money. Under the frame of capitalism, Audre Lorde paints a much clearer picture maybe than I do of what the pursuit of freedom would look like in our own experience, and what it expects of us as a people. In the paper Age, Race, Sex and Class, Audre Lorde's perspective, how can I say, really does a beautiful thing of complicating our idea of freedom. I say that because, you know, while reading Sarah Parker Remond's speech and letter, the letter goes on to talk about how hate is really a poison that spreads among the social fabric, and that's how anti-blackness is replicated. That's how anti-blackness is replicated, in that there's a spirit of hate amongst, at her time, slave traders, but amongst whiteness as a concept, amongst the social fabric of how people relate to each other, in a way that reproduces an anti-black social way of relating. Oh, Audre Lorde says that in her paper, so she talks about, you know, how we as a people have misinterpreted what difference should do in a society, and she says that we need to look at our differences and instead of seeing them as a barrier that is insurmountable, a barrier that cannot be overcome, or should be interpreted as places of hate amongst each other. We should see our differences as points of inspiration to further honor each other in our variety, and just lend to a more creative, more open, more free type of society. Audre writes in her paper, institutionalized rejection of difference is an absolute necessity in a profit economy which needs outsiders as a surplus. As members of such an economy, we have all been programmed to respond to all human differences in one of three ways: to ignore it if that's not possible, copy it if we think it's dominant, or destroy it if we think it's subordinate. But we have no patterns for relating across human differences as equals. She finishes off to say that we should pour our energy not into pretending that we don't have differences, right? Doing that confines us. To get free, we need to build the social tools to be able to negotiate our differences into, and I quote, into a springboard for creative change in our lives. I think that's so interesting, and maybe very much counterintuitive to the way capitalism programs people to think of differences, right? Very much that we should use the energy of our differences, you know, to be able to tolerate being uncomfortable, being outside of your comfort zone, being able to understand the world from another person's perspective, is the thing that once you come into acceptance with that and you're able to produce something creative out of it, that's where you gain the most freedom. If we only ever came back to our differences to enforce them, right, to fight for them, we make a war of our differences, as opposed to a celebration, as opposed to an intimacy. Sarah Parker Remond's message on this Freedom Day is simple. Speak your truth to freedom. Use the power of your voice in public opinion to make the lives of others better. Audre Lorde says, in the capitalist state, the way to do this is to know that change means growth, and growth can be painful. But we sharpen self-definition by exposing the self in work and struggle together with those whom we define as different from ourselves, although sharing the same goals.
To me, we are the most beautiful creatures in the whole world, black people. So my job is to make them more curious about where they came from and their own identity and pride in that identity.